Well, let's begin with what could be a major step forward in the understanding of what happened on board Germanwings Flight 9525 in the moments before it crashed in the French Alps. The New York Times reporting tonight that one of the pilots left the cockpit before the plane began its descent and was unable to get back inside before the plane crashed. The report, which we have not been able to verify, cites a senior military official involved in the investigation. This comes after day 2 of the search and recovery mission in the French Alps, which so far has proven to be a daunting task. As you can see in this video released today by France's Interior Ministry, the site scattered with debris. There are also body parts in that area too, of course. And in some areas, the rocky terrain so slippery that crews need ropes to move around. But despite those challenges, progress was made during today's search. According to French investigators, the cockpit voice recordings were recovered from one of the plane's black boxes, but they still say they don't know when during the flight those voices were recorded. Officials are now examining the audio file. They're trying to figure out how it fits into the timeline of the crash. We also learned today that the plane was intact when it hit the mountain. Officials say they have ruled out the possibility of a large mid-air explosion. And there were reports today that the casing from the second black box has been found, but that's now been contradicted by French investigators. Officials say crews are still searching for the flight data recorder. CBC's Jeff Semple joins us now from Seine des Alpes near the crash site. And Jeff, first of all, what is the latest on the search?
Well, the search has now wrapped up for the evening, Ian, after a second day of search crews and helicopters scouring the mountainside, looking for bodies of passengers and looking for any clues as to why this plane went down. And late this afternoon, they announced they may have found one. The audio recorder from the cockpit that in fact was recovered yesterday but was found badly damaged is now said to be intact. It's good enough, they say, that you can actually hear the audio recording. You can hear voices and sounds from the cockpit, words and sounds that in the moments leading up to the crash could potentially help explain the otherwise inexplicable descent the plane made that lasted around 8 minutes, according to officials, without any mayday call. So investigators say today that they will be listening to and examining this audio tape and could have more information on it to release publicly within a matter of days, Ian.
So a lot of work still to go for investigators, obviously for families around the world to an extent. This is, of course, a time to grieve. And we know among the 150 victims, learning today that they're from a total of 16 countries, most of them, though, of course, from Germany and Spain. And Jeff, we've also learned that some of the families have decided to travel to the villages near the crash site.
That's right. We've heard a number of reports that some of them are planning to head this way, that they want to be here, to come here to mourn. And in fact, Lufthansa, the airline involved in yesterday's plane crash, is now offering them free flights here if they do want to come. And as you mentioned, you're right. We were talking this time yesterday about how this was really a European tragedy, but over the last several hours, that list of passengers' identities has grown and the nationalities involved has grown significantly. You mentioned the majority are German and Spanish, but a number of them were American, British, and Japanese, among others. So this really is a tragedy that has struck countries right around the world, Ian.
And suddenly that village you're in, Seine des Alpes, is thrust into this role as being the headquarters for international media and so many more. Describe for us what it's been like there.
Well, it's been remarkable to see, really. This is a very small village, in fact, a cluster of small towns in this area, really on a mountainside. And while this is a global tragedy and we are seeing a global response, we're also seeing a small town, a village response. People here have heard that some of the family members of the victims might be coming this way. So the mayor of one of the towns just down the road from here has announced plans to set up hundreds of beds in the town's community center and in a sports hall. And ordinary people in this village are offering to open up their homes to the family members of the victims who want to come, so that if they do, they'll have a place to stay in.
CBC's Jeff Semple in Seine les Alpes, France. Thank you. I want to take you back to that New York Times story that one of the pilots was locked out of the cabin. If this is accurate, it would completely change our understanding of the crash. It is just one report, but it does come from a highly respected news organization. I want to bring in Johanna Wagstaff to help talk us through these issues. You're an aviation buff, a recreational pilot. You've been studying up a lot on this. So when you hear that scenario, that possible scenario, what comes to mind?
Well, first of all, obviously raising a whole new set of questions tonight if the report is true. But I wasn't surprised to hear that one pilot was out of the cockpit, especially at this time in the flight. Once you hit cruising altitude, which is when this incident began. Generally, that's a time after takeoff when all the checks are complete. One of the pilots can step out, use the restroom. So that wasn't surprising to hear. But of course, the two big questions: why was the pilot locked out? Was it on purpose from the pilot inside the cockpit, or was the pilot inside the cockpit incapacitated, unable to let the second pilot in? And something we've mentioned that is another big question: why was one pilot left alone in the cockpit? Generally, you are not allowed to leave one pilot alone in the cockpit for these various situations. So normally you would get an aircrew member to come in if one pilot needed to use the restroom. And it doesn't sound like, again, we can't say anything with certainty, but it sounds like one pilot was left alone in that cockpit.
Since September 11th, of course, these cockpit doors have been made even stronger. They're supposed to keep the pilots safe, but an unintended consequence could be it makes it impossible for somebody to come in unless that single pilot was incapacitated. And we do know, you've been doing some research into this, there is a protocol, there is a process to get in through that locked door if that pilot's incapacitated.
That's right. Yeah, I've been looking up on the Airbus, and if there is a procedure that if the pilots were incapacitated, a flight crew member could get in without having the pilots in the cockpit let them in. They'd have to enter a code, and there's a 5-minute wait section. So during that 5-minute wait section, if the pilots in the cockpit did not want that person to enter, they could continually override that code. But if they were incapacitated, they were unable to answer that entry code, then within 5 minutes, somebody could be granted entry into the cockpit.
It's interesting as we work through this. So if the New York Times is right and a pilot was locked out, if the pilot inside, behind that locked door, the flight deck, didn't want anyone else to come in, pretty easy for them to make sure.
Right.
And you know, this would explain one of the mysteries of this story, which is why there was no communication from the flight deck throughout this 8 or 9 or 10-minute descent.
Absolutely. And this is the big one. For the past couple of days now, we followed the rules of the air, which is aviate, navigate, and communicate after an emergency procedure. So we knew that if there was an emergency in the cockpit and they entered that emergency descent, then navigation, which would be changing the heading or the course, would come second. That didn't happen. And third would be communication. And now with this new information, we're not even sure if that first step happened. And definitely no communication was made from the cockpit, and the transponder wasn't put on any emergency code.
You remember we talked earlier today, we heard from the French Aviation Authority, their equivalent of the Transportation Safety Board, that this didn't seem to be a depressurization incident.
Yes.
Didn't make sense to us, right? Because
yes.
so many of our experts and other experts
all of the
have been
analysts
saying,
were saying that's what they thought.
Yeah, it seemed that way. But if they had this other theory, we know they've listened to the cockpit voice recorder, that would explain it. We don't know if the New York Times report is correct, but here's a scenario where it would help explain some of the other things we've heard. Johanna Wagstaff, thank you very much.
You're welcome.